Hey guys! Tonight we journey back, way back, to a world that's usually painted in shimmering gold, massive stone, and serene statues of gods with bird heads. You know the picture. Pyramids stabbing the horizon, pharaohs strutting around like divine celebrities, and hieroglyphs spelling out eternal glory. But here's the truth. While the upper crust got to bathe in incense and sit on fancy chairs, the overwhelming majority of people in ancient Egypt were living a life that was less glorious eternal kingdom and more permanent backache with a side of blisters. And that's what we're doing tonight. Forget the pharaohs for a moment. We're not here to worship Ramses' abs of granite. We're here to crawl into the mud huts, fields, and work camps to see what life was actually like for the commoners. Spoiler alert, it was tough, sweaty, and often smelly. But before we dive in, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing this little global time map unfold in the comments section. And hey, make yourself comfy. Dim the lights, grab some water, maybe turn on a fan for that cozy background hum. We're about to take a long walk through history, and trust me, you'll want to pace yourself. All right, let's set the stage. Ancient Egypt, land of the Nile, the so-called gift of the river. The Nile's annual flooding was what made this civilization possible. Without that rich black silt deposited on the floodplain, Egypt would have been just another sandy wasteland. Instead, it became a breadbasket, a kingdom where wheat and barley fed millions. But here's the kicker. While the scribes and priests wrote poems about the Nile being a benevolent father, the common farmer's relationship with it was less poetic muse and more unpredictable boss who can fire you any year. Too much flood, crops destroyed. Too little flood, crops destroyed. Either way, guess who still had to pay taxes in grain? Yeah, the farmer. So imagine yourself. You're not a pharaoh, not a noble, not even a scribe with ink-stained fingers. You're a field worker, one of the nameless thousands bending under the Egyptian sun. Your day starts early, before sunrise, because if you wait until the heat really kicks in, you're basically roasting alive in linen. Your clothes? A simple kilt if you're a man, a rough linen dress if you're a woman. No jewelry, no bling, no golden scarab amulets like you see in the museums, just sweat, dust, and calluses. Breakfast? Forget eggs and bacon. More likely, it's a hunk of bread so hard it could double as a weapon, maybe dipped in beer. And don't imagine a crisp, cold lager here. This was thick, porridge-like beer, cloudy and sour, but packed with calories. It was cheap fuel for endless hours of labor. You drink it, wipe the foam off your lips, and grab your tools. Wooden plows, stone sickles. Nothing glamorous, just back-to-back manual labor. And then there's the work itself.
Farming in ancient Egypt wasn't just about dropping seeds in the ground and watching Instagram-worthy fields of wheat grow. First, you're wading into mud and water, building and repairing irrigation canals by hand. The Nile doesn't exactly come with a convenient system of ditches pre-installed. So you, your neighbors, and probably half the village dig, dredge, and drag baskets of wet soil until your arms feel like they're falling off. Then, when it's time to sow, you walk up and down the freshly flooded fields, scattering seeds while your buddy herds goats or pigs right behind you. Why? Because the animals trample the seeds into the mud, ancient Egypt's version of a tractor. And after the sowing, it's months of tending, repairing dikes, and praying the Nile doesn't betray you. Oh, and remember, this isn't a free hobby farm. You don't keep all that grain. A big chunk goes straight to the state. Pharaoh's officials come by with their little tally sticks and scrolls, making sure you hand over your due, because the pyramids don't build themselves. Well, technically, they sort of do, with the sweat of people like you. Now, let's say the flood was kind and your harvest is decent. You haul it in baskets, you thresh it with wooden flails, you winnow it by tossing grain in the wind, and finally, you grind it on stone querns until your knees ache from kneeling for hours. Archaeologists can literally tell who did this job most of their lives just by looking at skeletons. The joints, worn smooth like sandpaper. The teeth, ground down to nubs from eating bread laced with grit. Because, yes, when you grind grain on stone, tiny bits of rock get in. Congratulations, you're chewing gravel every day of your life. And this isn't just men's work. Women were grinding grain constantly, baking, brewing, hauling water, and keeping households afloat. Forget spa days or lounging in cool shade. Daily life was one long cycle of repetitive, bone-breaking chores. Now, you might be thinking, at least Sundays were for resting, right? Wrong. That's the beauty of the ancient world. No weekends. Time was measured by seasons and floods, not by personal downtime. The only real breaks came during festivals, when the temples threw huge parties with beer, music, and feasting. But even then, guess who provided the labor to set everything up? Yeah, the commoners again. So, while Hollywood wants you to imagine Egypt as the land of eternal golden sunsets, for the people actually living it, the daily grind was just that, a grind. Hot, exhausting, unrelenting. And yet, without their sweat, there'd be no pyramids, no temples, no glorious civilization for us to marvel at. So let's say your harvest work is done. You've handed over your grain, survived another season of chewing sandpaper bread, and maybe, just maybe, you think you'll get a breather. Time to relax, right? Wrong. Because when the Nile floods and farming slows down, the state doesn't just let you chill. No, it's time for corvée labor. Basically, mandatory public service, which is a nice way of saying, congratulations, you're building monuments now. Forget Netflix and air-conditioned downtime. Your vacation is hauling stone blocks, dredging canals, or helping raise massive temples to gods you'll never meet personally. And the crown jewel of this labor system? The pyramids. Those massive, iconic tombs weren't whipped together by slaves in chains like Hollywood loves to imagine. They were largely the result of this seasonal labor system, where ordinary farmers were drafted to work in huge teams, living in state-run work camps. Now, picture those camps. Forget the idea of nice military barracks with tidy bunks. Excavations around the Giza Plateau show us rows of mud brick dorms crammed with workers, each one about the size of a modern parking space. Privacy? None. Comfort? Forget it. You're lying shoulder to shoulder with sweaty strangers after a 12-hour shift of hauling stone. It smells like dust, sweat, and the occasional cooking fire, if you're lucky. And the work itself? Backbreaking doesn't even cover it. Dragging multi-ton blocks across sledges, pulling ropes until your hands blister, stomping in the dust with hundreds of others. The Egyptians were brilliant engineers, sure, using water to slick the sand, ramps to angle the ascent. But even with clever tricks, it was still raw muscle power doing the heavy lifting. Your muscle power.
Meals in camp were simple. Bread, beer, onions, maybe fish if the overseers were generous. Not gourmet, but at least the state kept workers reasonably fed, because starving laborers don't haul stone very well. Archaeologists even found evidence of organized bakeries and breweries right at the work sites, churning out loaves and beer like factories. But the toll on your body? Brutal. Skeletons found from these workers show arthritis, spinal damage, broken bones that sometimes healed, sometimes didn't, and you thought your desk job was rough. Let's not forget the whip-wielding overseers. Yes, corvée wasn't technically slavery, you weren't permanently owned, but it sure didn't feel like freedom. Overseers enforced quotas, kept things moving, and if you lagged, you'd probably meet the sharp end of discipline. Ancient Egyptian art even shows stick-wielding supervisors standing over rows of laborers. Motivation, ancient style.
And it wasn't just pyramid duty. The state used commoners for endless projects: temple construction, irrigation repairs, quarrying stone, hauling statues that weighed as much as a herd of elephants. You were a cog in a machine designed to keep the divine ruler's image shiny and eternal. Did anyone care about your name? Not really. The pharaoh's cartouche got carved into walls for eternity. Your contribution? Maybe a broken bone, forgotten in the sand.
But outside the big state projects, daily grind at home wasn't exactly cushy either. Let's talk housing. If you were a commoner, your home was probably a 1 or 2 roomed mud brick hut. Mud brick, because it was cheap, abundant, and easy to make. Just Nile mud mixed with straw, baked in the sun. Walls cracked in the heat, roofs leaked in the rain, and summers inside those ovens, miserable. Furniture was minimal. Maybe a mat to sleep on, a clay jar for water, a grinding stone in the corner. Forget plush couches or golden thrones. Your luxury was having a stool to sit on. Family life revolved around work. Kids weren't exactly running around carefree either. They were put to chores as soon as they could walk straight. Herding goats, fetching water, grinding grain, little hands were valuable labor. Childhood was short. You grew up fast because life expectancy wasn't exactly generous. Many commoners didn't see 50. Some didn't even see 30.
And hygiene? Let's just say you wouldn't want to be trapped in a closed room with a group of Egyptian farmers. Water was precious. Baths were rare luxuries, and soap wasn't a thing. People sometimes rubbed oil on their skin to keep it from cracking, then scraped it off with a tool. Not exactly a spa day. Lice were constant companions, and diseases ran rampant. Ever seen those ancient lice combs in museums? Yeah, they weren't decorative. They were survival gear. Still, religion seeped into every corner of life. Even the poorest huts had little shrines, clay figurines of protective gods, amulets scratched into pottery. Because when your daily life is this grueling, you cling to the hope that someone, anyone up there is paying attention. That all this toil, this endless grind, might mean something in the grand cosmic scheme. And while the pharaoh was supposedly divine, closer to home it was household gods and fertility figures that mattered most. You prayed not for pyramids, but for healthy kids, a decent harvest, and maybe, just maybe, a year without catastrophic floods. So, between farming, forced labor, cramped housing, disease, and endless chores, the Egyptian commoner's life was one long, exhausting marathon. But hey, at least you got to contribute to one of the 7 wonders of the world, right? Your reward? Eternal anonymity. So you've survived another day of trudging through fields, hauling stone, or kneeling over a grinding quern until your knees scream. What do you get for dinner? Brace yourself. It's not exactly a Michelin-starred menu. The backbone of your diet was bread and beer. Morning, noon, night. Bread and beer. Wheat and barley were everywhere. And while it sounds kind of cozy at first, oh, a rustic life with fresh bread, in reality, the bread was often coarse, gritty, and full of bits of stone from the grinding process. Remember how archaeologists found skeletons with teeth worn down to stumps? That's the reason. Every bite of your daily loaf was like chewing sandpaper. You weren't just eating carbs, you were filing your molars down for free. Beer, though, was the great equalizer. Not the golden, bubbly stuff you'd order at a bar today, but a thick, soupy brew that looked more like liquid bread.
low alcohol, high calories, and safer to drink than water pulled straight from the Nile. Kids drank it, adults guzzled it. And honestly, without beer, half the population might have collapsed from exhaustion. Beer was hydration, food, and buzz, all in one foamy bowl.
If you were lucky, you'd supplement with onions, garlic, leeks, maybe a few figs or dates if the season was right. Protein? Fish from the Nile, some fowl, or, if you were dirt poor, locusts roasted crunchy. Meat from cows or sheep was a luxury, usually reserved for the upper classes, or festival days. Ordinary folks probably only tasted beef when leftovers from temple sacrifices trickled down to them. For everyone else, meat was a rumor. Now, here's where it gets nasty. Parasites. When your diet revolves around raw fish, grain stored in hot mud brick rooms, and water that's basically Nile soup, parasites are a fact of life. Tapeworms, roundworms, schistosomiasis, say that 5 times fast, were the uninvited dinner guests in everyone's intestines. Mummies reveal just how widespread these conditions were. Imagine going through your day already drained from endless labor while worms inside you are stealing your calories. Ancient life? Not glamorous. And when you got sick, ancient Egyptian medicine was a curious blend of practical remedies and magic spells. They had doctors, some highly trained scribes specializing in healing, but access depended on your status. If you were a humble farmer, your medicine cabinet was whatever your family knew, maybe a poultice of honey and herbs, or a whispered prayer to a household deity. Honey was a go-to for wounds because it actually works as an antiseptic, but a lot of treatments also leaned into charms, reciting words to scare off the evil spirit believed to cause the sickness. Broken bones? Sometimes they were set well enough that they healed straight. Archaeologists have found mummies with healed fractures, proof that at least some commoners got real medical care. But plenty of others show mangled bones or signs of infections that killed them young. And remember, there were no antibiotics. A cut from a sickle blade or a smashed finger from hauling stone could turn fatal if infection set in. Teeth were a special nightmare. That gritty bread destroyed mouths, leading to abscesses, infections, and constant pain. Imagine trying to plow a field with a raging toothache and no dentist but a neighbor with a knife and a strong arm. Fun times. But let's not make it sound like life was only endless misery. Egyptians did carve out joy, mostly in the form of festivals. The calendar was peppered with religious celebrations tied to gods, harvests, and the Nile. These festivals were your only real breaks, a time for drinking, music, dancing, and yes, letting loose. Take the Festival of Hathor, goddess of love and music. This wasn't a polite afternoon tea. We're talking drinking beer until you're wobbling, playing sistrums and drums, and basically partying like your boss isn't a god king. Women and men alike joined in, singing bawdy songs, clapping, even engaging in what the priests politely called fertility rituals. For a population normally stuck in the grind, festivals were like cracking open a pressure valve. And festivals also meant food. Temples sometimes distributed offerings to the crowds. Bread, dried fish, even cuts of meat if the gods were feeling generous. Imagine the sheer joy of biting into beef after months of chewing gritty bread. It was heaven on earth. Festivals were communal, chaotic, and necessary. Without them, the grind might have crushed people entirely. Still, the downtime was fleeting. When the drums quieted and the beer pots emptied, you went back to reality. Sweating in the fields, hauling water, bowing before tax collectors, trying not to keel over from a tooth abscess. The highs were short, the lows were daily, and resilience was the only constant. And yet somehow they endured.
not just endured, they built monuments so massive we still gawk at them today, and left behind a culture that still fascinates us. But the irony remains. All of it rested on the cracked backs and worn teeth of commoners whose names history rarely bothered to record. All right, let's zoom in on what you'd actually look like day to day if you were one of these Egyptian commoners trudging through the grind. Forget the fancy linen pleats and golden collars you see on pharaoh statues. Your wardrobe was as simple as it gets. Men usually wore a basic linen kilt tied around the waist. That's it. No pockets, no belt with a phone holster, nothing fancy. Just a white, or more realistically, dirt brown, rectangle of cloth. Women wore plain linen dresses, sometimes with a strap over one shoulder, sometimes two. And linen wasn't some soft, breezy luxury either. It was stiff and scratchy, and after a few washes in Nile water mixed with ash, it probably felt like wearing a sack made of sandpaper. Children? For the first years of their lives, they often wore nothing at all. Naked kids running around the village was perfectly normal until they were about 6 or 7. Honestly, it was practical. Why waste precious linen on someone who's just going to roll in the mud? But despite the simplicity, appearance mattered. Even the poorest Egyptians cared about looking presentable. Hair was a big deal. Men often shaved their heads in the heat, not because it looked sleek, but because lice were everywhere. Women might braid their hair or clip it short, but wigs were the real fashion statement. Of course, if you were a commoner, your wig wasn't made of fine human hair like the elites. Nope, yours might be woven from palm fiber, itchy and cheap. Still, it was better than nothing when you wanted to look festival at a festival. Cosmetics weren't just for nobles either. Everyone, even commoners, used them, though not for beauty in the Instagram sense. Kohl, that dark eyeliner you always see in Egyptian art, doubled as sun protection and insect repellent. It helped cut the glare of the desert sun and maybe kept the flies from driving you insane. Men, women, even kids sometimes smeared it on. Imagine your 6-year-olds with goth eyeliner, not for fashion, but to keep sand glare from frying their eyes. That was normal. Perfumes and oils were also common, partly because, let's be honest, bathing wasn't. People rubbed oils on their skin to fight dryness and sometimes to mask the smell of sweat, animals, and smoke that clung to everything. The elite had fancy scented oils imported from far-off lands. You probably had cheap, local stuff that went rancid in a week. But hey, you tried. Now let's talk about family life. For most commoners, the household was the center of existence. Marriage was practical, not romantic, though there's evidence couples cared for each other deeply in their own ways. Men farmed or worked in state projects. Women managed the home, baked the bread, brewed beer, raised kids, and tended small gardens or animals. Division of labor was clear, but both sides worked brutally hard. Children were expected to help as soon as they could. Girls might learn grinding and baking from their mothers. Boys followed their fathers to the fields or workshops. There were no toys in the modern sense, but archaeologists have found clay animals, balls, and carved figurines that kids probably played with when they weren't fetching water. Childhood wasn't all doom, but it was short. By the time you hit your teens, you were essentially an adult, ready for marriage and labor. Speaking of water, fetching it was a constant chore. Wells were rare. Most villages sat near the Nile, but carrying heavy jars back and forth every day was exhausting. Some households had donkeys to help, but many relied on sheer muscle. Imagine starting your morning with a trek to the river, balancing a jar that weighs as much as a modern suitcase on your shoulder. And you do it again in the evening, every single day. Leisure, when it happened, was simple. Storytelling, music, and board games like Sinet gave people some escape. Picture a group of exhausted farmers huddled around a board game after sundown, laughing over moves while gnawing on onions and sipping beer. Those little flashes of normal humanity are what make the grind bearable. Religion, of course, colored all of this. It wasn't just temples and priests. Ordinary households had little altars, amulets, and charms. A clay figurine of the hippo goddess Tauret might sit on your shelf, watching over childbirth. Amulets shaped like scarabs or eyes hung from your neck, not as jewelry, but as protection against bad luck, illness, or the evil eye. Magic wasn't separate from life. It was life. You didn't just cook a meal, you muddled a prayer over it. You didn't just step into the fields, you offered a quick word to the Nile. Because when everything, your crops, your body, your kids' survival was this precarious, you needed every ounce of help you could get, divine or otherwise.
So picture it all together. Scratchy linen, sweat-smeared eyeliner, lice combs by the door, kids hauling jars, women grinding grain until their joints locked, men dragging plows through the mud, everyone praying to 100 different gods just to make it through another year. That was the reality behind the golden masks and carved hieroglyphs. And while the pharaoh's name might shine forever on a tomb wall, the real Egypt was built from the anonymous grind of people like you, commoners, sweating under the same sun that gleamed on the pyramids.
Imagine waking up before sunrise, because if you wait even a little too long, the air outside will already feel like someone opened the door to an oven. That was reality for countless farmers, herders, and builders living in arid zones from Egypt to Mesopotamia. We romanticize golden sands and glowing pyramids, but to the average commoner, the sun was not some poetic backdrop. It was an executioner, waiting patiently for you to miscalculate your day. So, you got up early, sometimes absurdly early, because that was the only way to steal a few hours of bearable labor before the inferno started. Think of it like an ancient version of setting your alarm for 4:30 a.m., not because you want to be productive, but because survival demands it. Sleep in? Congratulations! Your body is now a raisin. The daily grind under the sun was merciless. Farmers bent over dry, cracked soil, hauling water with buckets or shuttling it through primitive channels. Every single drop had to be moved by human muscle or animal power. We complain about a slow Wi-Fi connection. They complained about how many trips it took to keep a patch of wheat from shriveling. And remember, this wasn't hobby gardening. If the crops failed, so did your family. Construction workers, those guys hauling limestone blocks or stacking mud bricks, had it even worse. Picture carrying heavy loads under direct sunlight. No modern hard hats, no sunscreen, not even a proper shade. Ancient Egyptian records talk about how workers were rationed with jugs of beer and onions to keep them going. Beer wasn't a luxury, it was hydration and calories in one. The Red Bull of the Bronze Age. Without it, you weren't lifting anything. And let's not sugarcoat it. Heat stroke was real. They didn't have the word for it, but they sure experienced it. Dizziness, headaches, collapsing mid-task. Some survived by being dragged into the shade. Others didn't. In Mesopotamian tablets, there are accounts of offerings to gods after workers died in the fields. Because when the sun claimed you, people assumed divine judgment was involved. In reality, you just cooked from the inside out. Shade, then, became as valuable as gold. Every scrap of cloth, every tree,
Every wall was a potential lifesaver. Houses were oriented not just for looks, but to minimize exposure to heat. Even small huts were built with narrow windows to reduce sunlight and catch breezes. And if you were lucky enough to live near a grove of palms or sycamores, you probably thanked those trees daily, because their shadow could mean the difference between collapsing and finishing your chores.
Now, you might think, okay, but at least nights were cooler, right? Sort of. Yes, temperatures dropped after the sun set, but that didn't mean comfort. Sometimes it was a sharp swing, from scorching heat to bone-chilling cold. Imagine sweating through the day, then shivering at night in the same thin tunic. Sleeping outside was common in desert regions, but so was dealing with biting insects and the occasional sandstorm rolling in at 2 a.m. Rest wasn't always restful. And while we're talking about the brutal cycle of heat, let's mention skin. Sunscreen didn't exist. A wide-brimmed hat was the best you could hope for, and if you didn't have one, your skin blistered and peeled. Dark tans weren't trendy. They were the mark of poverty, proof that you were stuck in the fields rather than lounging in shaded courtyards like the elite. In fact, many societies associated pale skin with wealth precisely because it meant you didn't have to work under the sun. Irony at its finest. Modern people pay money to tan, but in antiquity, a tan was basically your time card.
Even animals suffered. Oxen and donkeys, plodding through dusty fields, needed constant watering. If they collapsed, so did your livelihood. Herding goats across parched land meant not only finding grass, but making sure they didn't keel over from heat. Livestock were assets, but also liabilities in a climate that punished every living thing equally. Yet, for all the misery, people adapted in surprisingly clever ways. Work schedules were flexible, shifting to dawn and dusk. Midday, when the sun was truly unbearable, often became rest hours where people sought shade, napped, or retreated indoors. It wasn't laziness, it was survival strategy. Some cultures even wove this rhythm into their social and religious practices, timing prayers or rituals around the rising and setting sun.
And let's not forget hydration. We take water bottles for granted. They carried clay jars, heavy and breakable, often filled in the morning and rationed carefully throughout the day. Drink too much too fast, and you risked running out before reaching home. Drink too little, and you risked collapsing. It was a balancing act with stakes higher than any game show. So when you think about life under ancient suns, don't imagine golden rays and postcard-perfect pyramids. Imagine sweat stinging your eyes, cracked lips, blistered skin, the feeling of your heartbeat pounding harder with every step in the open air. The sun wasn't your friend. It was the boss you could never quit, the overseer you could never bribe. Survive it, and you earned not just your bread, but your very existence for another day.
Here's the funny thing about living in extreme heat. The very instincts you and I might have today, like wearing as little as possible, were exactly the wrong move. Ancient people figured that out fast. Instead of running around half naked, they layered up in ways that look counterintuitive, but made perfect sense. Let's start with clothes. Picture a farmer in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. You might imagine bare chests glistening under the sun like in some Hollywood epic. Reality check, not smart. Direct sunlight scorches your skin in minutes. So what did they do? They wore long, loose garments made of light-colored linen or wool. These weren't just clothes. They were portable microclimates. The loose fit trapped little pockets of air, creating insulation that kept heat out and let sweat evaporate more effectively. White and pale tones reflected sunlight, turning your body into less of a frying pan. It was, in effect, ancient climate tech, far cheaper than a modern moisture-wicking shirt, and honestly, not far off in terms of design.
Then comes headgear. Turbans, headscarves, veils. This wasn't fashion, it was survival gear. Wrapping cloth around the head wasn't just about shielding from sunburn. It helped regulate temperature, protected against wind-blown sand, and could even serve as a filter in dust storms if you pulled it across your face. One wrap of cloth, a dozen uses. Multi-tools before multi-tools existed. Some desert nomads still use the same style today, proving that if it works, you don't mess with it. Footwear also mattered. Sandals may look flimsy, but they were perfect for hot terrain, light, breathable, and easy to repair. Thick leather soles protected feet from scorching ground, while open tops prevented sweat from pooling. It wasn't comfort in the modern sense, but it was efficiency. And efficiency was the line between finishing your trek or burning your soles raw.
Now, let's move into the real marvels, shelters. The genius of ancient architecture is that it wasn't just about walls and roofs. It was about climate control without electricity. Mud brick houses were the standard in many desert societies. Why? Because mud brick has thermal mass. That means it soaks up heat slowly during the day and releases it at night, smoothing out the brutal temperature swings between noon and midnight. You can almost think of it as a battery, storing solar energy whether you wanted it or not, then letting it out when the desert chill rolled in. And people didn't just stop at walls. They oriented buildings with purpose. Narrow windows cut into walls reduced heat gain, but allowed airflow. Roofs were flat so people could sleep on them at night under open skies when interiors got too stuffy. In towns, streets were often laid out in narrow, winding paths, not for aesthetics, but to maximize shade and funnel breezes. The whole city plan was like a giant air conditioning system disguised as urban design.
Then there were courtyards. These open spaces, often shaded by awnings or trees, acted like cooling cores for the home. Families gathered there for meals, kids played there, animals rested there. Sometimes they even had small water basins or jars set in the middle. When the water evaporated, it cooled the surrounding air a little, like a DIY swamp cooler. Small detail, huge difference. Imagine stepping into that shaded space after slogging outside. It must have felt like heaven. Water storage was another area where ingenuity shone. Clay jars weren't just vessels. They were refrigerators before refrigeration. Porous clay allowed
tiny amounts of water to seep out and evaporate, cooling the contents inside. Store your water in a ceramic jar, and suddenly you had refreshingly cool drinks in the middle of the desert. No ice cubes needed.
Communal wells became social lifelines. They weren't just about drawing water. They were where gossip spread, deals were struck, marriages arranged. The well was the hub, the water cooler, both literally and figuratively. In fact, control of wells often determined political power. Whoever owned the water source owned survival. Of course, the elites had it easier. Wealthier homes might have multiple rooms arranged around shaded courtyards, with servants fetching water and fanning them while they lounged. Frescoes and records even show the use of palm fronds dipped in water to wave cool air across the body. It wasn't a Dyson fan, but hey, same idea. Meanwhile, the poor made do with open walls, simple shelters, and prayers that the wind would blow in their favor.
And yet, what's remarkable is how resilient these adaptations were. You can walk into villages in modern Egypt, Iran, or Morocco today and see the same mud brick houses, the same wind towers, the same clothing styles still in use. These weren't just stopgap measures, they were sustainable, honed over centuries of trial and error. Now think about how much of our modern world depends on energy-hungry cooling systems. Crank up the AC, close the blinds, forget the outside. If power went out, many cities would become unlivable in days. But ancient people, they designed for failure. Their systems worked with nature, not against it. Low tech, sure, but shockingly effective. So when you picture them trudging through blistering heat, don't just imagine suffering. Picture ingenuity, the quiet genius of survival. Loose robes doubling as portable shade, homes acting as giant thermal batteries, courtyards as miniature oases. Every scrap of cloth and every mud brick was part of an ongoing chess match against the sun. And, remarkably, they often won.
Water in the desert wasn't just precious, it was the currency of life itself. To put it bluntly, you could survive a missed meal, maybe even two, but miss out on water and you'd be bargaining with death in just a few hours. Ancient communities understood this at a primal level, and so they built entire ways of life around chasing, guarding, and rationing that most elusive treasure. Let's start with the most famous symbol, the oasis. From a distance, it looked like paradise. Shimmering palms, a cluster of reeds, a splash of green in a sea of beige. To a caravan slogging through dunes, it must have felt like stumbling onto a miracle. But oases weren't free gifts. They were geologic quirks, where underground aquifers bubbled close enough to the surface to support plant life. And because of that, they became magnets for human settlement, trade, and inevitably conflict. Controlling an oasis meant controlling wealth, power, and survival
Lose one to a rival tribe, and you might as well start digging your own grave. Beyond natural gifts, humans invented incredible solutions. The Qanat system of ancient Persia is still jaw-dropping today. Imagine you're standing in blazing sun, and someone tells you, "We're going to dig a tunnel under this desert, gently sloping for miles, to bring water from the mountains straight to our town." Sounds insane, right? But it worked. Workers carved long underground channels with vertical shafts at intervals for ventilation and maintenance. The slope was so precise that water flowed steadily without pumps. This wasn't backyard DIY. It was engineering that required math, planning, and sheer stubborn willpower. Entire cities in Iran and beyond survived on these hidden rivers. In Egypt, the Nile was both savior and tyrant. Yes, it provided steady water in a bone-dry environment, but it also came with mood swings. Flood too little and famine stalked the land. Flood too much and whole villages washed away. So Egyptians got busy with canals, dikes, and basins to tame the beast. They tracked flood patterns, prayed to Hapi, the god of inundation, and measured levels with nilometers carved in stone. Think about that. An entire civilization's calendar, religion, and economy revolved around water management. No Nile control, no pyramids, no pharaohs, no Egypt, period.
Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, farmers wrestled with the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers flooded unpredictably, so the locals dug networks of canals that diverted and stored water. But irrigation was a double-edged sword. Use it too much, and the soil turned salty, poisoning crops. The Sumerians and Babylonians knew this all too well. Records show declining yields over centuries as salinization took its toll. It's almost poetic. The same water that gave life also sowed destruction if misused. But not every community had big rivers at their disposal. Many relied on wells. Digging a well in the ancient world wasn't a neat weekend project. It was grueling, dangerous labor. Workers dug down through rock and sand, sometimes dozens of meters, without modern drills or safety harnesses. One wrong move and the walls could collapse. But when the diggers hit water, it was like striking oil today, only far more essential. Wells became sacred places. Stories and myths grew around them. Control of a single deep well could elevate a family's status for generations.
Then there were clever storage tricks. Clay jars weren't just containers, they doubled as cooling devices. Because clay is porous, a little water seeped through the walls and evaporated, chilling the contents inside. Ancient refrigerators powered by physics. Wealthier cities dug cisterns, vast underground reservoirs lined with stone to keep water fresh and shielded from evaporation. Some cisterns in places like Jerusalem are still intact after thousands of years, proving how critical these systems were. And let's not forget the psychological weight of water. In cultures surrounded by drought and death, water became more than a necessity.
It was divine. Springs were holy. Rivers were gods. Rituals often demanded libations, offerings poured out to the deities, even though every drop poured away might be one less to drink. It was a statement. We honored the source of life, because without its favor, we're finished. Imagine sacrificing water in a desert. Talk about devotion.
Daily life revolved around careful rationing. A farmer might set aside jars for drinking, others for animals, and just enough for cooking. Washing was rare and often limited to hands and faces. Bathing? Forget it. The elites might splash around in private basins, but commoners treated full-body washing as a festival luxury. Clothes weren't rinsed every day. They were beaten with sand or aired out in the wind. Hygiene took a back seat to hydration. Now, picture this in contrast with our world today. You probably use more water brushing your teeth than an ancient villager might have had for an entire day. Showers, lawns, sprinklers, luxuries unthinkable to people who measured life in gulps and drops. In fact, the modern phrase, "water is the new oil," doesn't quite do justice to how vital it was back then. Oil powers cars. Water powered existence.
Yet, against impossible odds, ancient people thrived. They didn't just find water, they organized around it, engineered it, fought wars over it, and worshipped it. Their survival strategies still echo today in qanats that still function, in irrigation techniques still in use, in religious traditions that still treat water as sacred. They remind us that life in the desert wasn't about beating nature into submission. It was about dancing with it, carefully, desperately, brilliantly. So the next time you pour yourself a casual glass of water without thinking, imagine carrying that same glass for miles under brutal sun, knowing it might be the difference between life and collapse. For ancient commoners, that wasn't imagination. Imagine waking up in Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. The sun hasn't even cleared the horizon, and already the air feels heavy, like someone threw a wool blanket over the entire world. You shuffle out of your mud brick house, bleary-eyed, and you know you have maybe 3-4 hours of decent working conditions before the day turns into one long argument with the gods of heat and dust. People back then weren't superhuman, but they were experts at bending their lives around the climate. Their survival wasn't just about stubborn endurance, it was about adapting everything: time, food, clothes, houses, even their mindset, to fit an environment that wanted to cook them alive.
The first and most obvious adaptation was time itself. In our world, where fluorescent lights and office clocks dictate everything, people cling to the 9-to-5 routine even if it makes no sense. In ancient hot zones, that would have been suicidal. Work began at dawn, sometimes even before. when the air was just cool enough to let your muscles move without feeling like they were boiling in your skin. Farmers, builders, herders, everyone poured themselves into the day's tasks before the sun turned fields into frying pans. By midday, everything stopped. The streets went quiet, tools were dropped, and entire villages seemed to vanish into the shade. It wasn't laziness. It was a communal ceasefire with the climate. You hunkered inside, maybe shared bread with your family, or dozed under a strip of cloth meant to catch a breeze. The day's rhythm revolved around the sun's brutality, and only when shadows grew long did life kick back into motion. We like to imagine we invented the siesta, but the ancients were way ahead, perfecting the art of dodging the hottest hours.
Food and drink played their part too. When clean water was scarce or unpredictable, people leaned on alternatives. Beer, for example, wasn't a weekend luxury. It was survival fuel. Lightly fermented, low in alcohol, more like a thick, grainy smoothie than the frothy pint we picture. It provided hydration, calories, and maybe a little courage to go back out into the sun. Imagine starting your morning shift with a pint of ancient brew. That was breakfast for countless workers along the Nile or the Euphrates. To balance this, diets leaned toward cooling and sustaining foods. Cucumbers plucked from gardens, melons bursting with water, dates sticky with sugar for quick energy. Salted fish kept the body supplied with electrolytes, while goat's milk or camel milk was often churned into a kind of yogurt drink that sat better in the stomach than plain milk on a scorching day. These weren't random choices. They were climate-smart diets, shaped by what actually kept people going when the air itself felt like fire.
Clothing mattered just as much. Forget anything tight, heavy, or stylish in our sense of the word. Linen ruled in Egypt, wool in Mesopotamia, cotton in India. Materials chosen for breathability, for how well they could wick away sweat and allow airflow. Outfits were loose, flowing, practical, designed not to flaunt, but to survive. And of course, light colors were the default, reflecting sunlight rather than soaking it in. Everyone understood the value of covering up, too. Wide-brimmed hats woven from reeds, cloth wraps around the head, turbans twisted just so. They weren't fashion statements. They were armor against the relentless glare. Step outside bareheaded, and you weren't bold. You were foolish. Architecture extended this battle against the sun. A home was more than shelter. It was strategy in baked mud and carved stone. Thick walls kept interiors cooler. Narrow alleys funneled breezes. Small windows minimized exposure. Courtyards were shaded sanctuaries, places where air could circulate and families gathered during the hottest hours. And rooftops weren't wasted space. They became the night's refuge. As twilight settled, people carried mats and blankets upstairs, turning flat roofs into communal dormitories under the open sky. You can almost picture it. Children whispering to each other, neighbors chatting across walls, stars stretching endlessly above. The rooftop wasn't just a bed, it was the cheapest, most effective air conditioner in history. But no one survived these climates alone. Survival was a team sport. Wells and cisterns provided shared lifelines, and irrigation systems demanded cooperation on a massive scale. Canals clogged with silt weren't just one farmer's problem, they threatened the entire harvest. Communities organized cleaning schedules, dug new trenches, rationed water, and argued bitterly about who got what share. Festivals and rituals often revolved around these cycles, blending spirituality with practicality. A ceremony for rain wasn't only about appeasing the gods. It was a way to gather the community, reinforce the importance of cooperation, and remind everyone that no one beat the climate alone. And then there was the mental game. Imagine facing blistering heat and dust storms without knowing when relief might come. You can't scroll through a weather app. You can only endure. Ancient cultures learned to bake patience into their worldview. Myths and proverbs hammered home the idea that suffering was seasonal, that endurance was honorable, that cycles of hardship always gave way to cycles of abundance. Egyptians sang hymns to the Nile's return. Mesopotamians told stories of gods who embodied drought and flood. Indians wove monsoon rhythms into their epics. The weather wasn't just background, it was destiny, woven into culture, religion, and identity. Acceptance became a form of resistance. You didn't fight the sun, you learned to bow to it, outlast it, and shape your life around its rhythms.
Put all of this together, and you get what looks like a survival manual for extreme living. Wake early, nap at midday, work when shadows are long, drink what hydrates, eat what refreshes, wear what breathes. Build homes that shelter, live in communities that cooperate, and tell stories that give suffering meaning. None of this was accidental. It was trial and error, passed down through generations until it became second nature. These people weren't barely scraping by. They were mastering a hostile environment with every tool they had. So next time someone complains that the office thermostat is set a little too high, remember the farmer in 2000 BCE who wrapped himself in linen, drank a jug of lukewarm beer for breakfast, harvested his fields before the sun roasted them into dust, and ended his day sleeping on a rooftop under the stars. Compared to that, our so-called heat problems start to look like very comfortable inconveniences. If you had to sum up ancient life in hot climates in one word, it might just be compromise. Every decision, from when to wake up to what to eat, was a balancing act with the elements. But nowhere was this balancing act more obvious than in the daily grind of labor. Work wasn't a casual, let me grab my iced latte and ease into the day kind of thing. It was relentless, physical, sweaty, and it dictated survival, not just for you, but for your entire family, sometimes your entire community. And because the sun and the seasons played referee,
labor had a rhythm that feels completely alien to most of us now. Take agriculture, for instance. We love to imagine fields of golden wheat swaying in the breeze. But picture that field when you've been hunched over it since dawn, with a wooden plow strapped to an ox that's just as grumpy about the heat as you are. The soil isn't forgiving. It's stubborn, clumpy, demanding hours of back-breaking tilling before it's ready for seeds. By the time the sun has climbed high, your back is screaming, your hands are blistered, and you've already sweated out what feels like your entire body weight. And the kicker? There's no break room, no cold water cooler humming in the corner. If you're lucky, you've got a leather water skin that's half warm by now, or maybe some diluted beer to take the edge off. And if you slack off, that's not just your problem. That's food your family doesn't eat come winter.
Builders had it even worse in many ways. Think about pyramid workers in Egypt or ziggurat builders in Mesopotamia. We like to romanticize their accomplishments, the soaring monuments, the eternal legacy carved into stone. But have you ever tried hauling limestone blocks under a noon sun that could fry an egg on your shoulder? Workers weren't just sweating, they were cooking. Dust filled their mouths, the grit cut into their skin, and the rhythm of work was punctuated not by cheerful singing, but by groans, shouted orders, and the constant threat of collapse, of scaffolding, of walls, of bodies. We don't often think about how many lives these wonders of the world chewed up just to exist. The monuments remain, the laborers' names vanish into the sand.
And then there were the people who worked with animals. Herding goats or camels across rocky terrain sounds almost picturesque, until you realize you're walking miles under a punishing sun with no shade in sight, trying to keep stubborn creatures in line while every part of your body begs for a pause. The animals themselves were survival tools, carrying water or goods, providing milk, meat, wool. Losing one could be disastrous, so the herder's job wasn't just a chore. It was a responsibility with very real stakes. Imagine being 12 years old, barefoot, trailing behind a small herd with nothing but a stick and the knowledge that if something happened, the family's survival could tilt toward disaster. Childhood wasn't a bubble. It was work from the start.
Women's labor, too, was relentless, and it went far beyond what we picture today. Grinding grain by hand wasn't some rustic Instagram moment. It was hours of kneeling over a heavy stone, pushing and pulling until your arms ached and your knees were raw. Baking bread meant feeding fires in the heat of summer, sweat dripping down your back while you tried not to burn the precious flour you'd spent so long grinding. Drawing water meant walking, often long distances, with heavy jars balanced on your shoulders or heads. Laundry wasn't tossing clothes into a machine, it was beating fabric against rocks at the edge of a river, bent over for hours, your skin cracking from the combination of sun, water, and soap
made from ashes or lye that stung your hands.
And then, woven into all of this was child rearing. Kids weren't just running free while adults toiled. They were integrated into the work early, carrying smaller loads, scaring birds from the fields, fetching tools, or helping with grinding and weaving. Childhood was training for adulthood, and the line between the two was thin. By the time a child was 10, they were essentially a small-scale adult worker, already contributing to the survival of the family. Play existed, sure, but it was squeezed into the margins, often using the very tools of work. Sticks became toys, stones became game pieces. Even leisure carried the imprint of labor.
What makes all this even more striking is how little room there was for illness or weakness. If you caught a fever in the middle of harvest, the work didn't pause. Your absence could mean crops spoiled in the field. If you twisted an ankle while carrying bricks, there wasn't a compensation plan or sick leave. You either dragged yourself back to the job, or someone else in your family picked up the slack, straining themselves to cover your share. Life had no buffer zone, no safety net. Work was survival, and survival was work. The two were indistinguishable. And through all this, the environment remained an unrelenting overseer. Dust storms could wipe out progress in an instant, burying fields under grit or collapsing half-finished walls. Floods could destroy months of labor in one night. Drought could make entire seasons of back-breaking work vanish into nothing, leaving people staring at parched earth where food should have been. And yet, the next day, you still had to get up, stretch your aching back, and go back to work. Because what choice did you have? The cycle didn't stop just because you wanted a break. The sun rose, the tasks loomed, and your hands were needed, always. And here's where it gets really humbling. We often measure ourselves against these ancient people and think, wow, they had it so hard. But from their perspective, it wasn't extraordinary. It was just life. They didn't wake up groaning about how unfair it was to labor in the heat without sunscreen and air conditioning. They woke up, put on their linen or wool, grabbed their tools, and did what had to be done. Not because they loved it, but because not doing it wasn't an option. Survival isn't glamorous, and it isn't optional. It's dirty, exhausting, and constant, but it's also deeply human. So when we talk about the pyramids, the fields of rice, the temples, the canals, really, when we talk about any achievement of the ancient world, we have to remember that beneath it all were millions of tired backs, blistered hands, sunburned faces, and weary eyes staring into the horizon as the day's work stretched endlessly ahead. The grind was the foundation, the invisible scaffolding that held up the monuments and the civilizations we marvel at today.
If daily labor was the backbone of survival, then rest, what little of it existed, was the fragile glue holding everything together. But before you start imagining hammocks swaying in the breeze, think again. Rest in the ancient world wasn't about comfort. It was about collapsing just enough to recharge before the next round of work. Sleep wasn't a luxury. It was the bare minimum a body demanded before being pushed back into the grind. Take the architecture of rest, for example. In Egypt or Mesopotamia, homes were cramped, hot, and simple, built from sun-dried mud bricks. Inside, there weren't plush mattresses or fluffy pillows. At best, there might be a woven mat of reeds or a thin layer of straw spread across a raised clay platform. Some families used wooden frames covered in rope or leather strips, which sagged under the weight of a tired body but kept you off the dirt floor where scorpions and bugs might wander. Comfort was relative. If the roof didn't leak and the floor didn't crawl, you were winning. Of course, with the climate being what it was, nights often meant heading to the rooftop. Imagine climbing a ladder after a day of punishing labor, lugging mats and blankets, and then lying flat under a sky so clear the Milky Way practically screamed at you. It sounds romantic until you remember that the rooftop was crowded with family members, mosquitoes buzzed constantly, and one unexpected sandstorm could turn your bedding into grit-filled misery. Still, it beat roasting inside a stifling room that trapped the day's heat like an oven. People weren't seeking luxury, they were seeking survivability, a few hours of tolerable air where lungs could expand without feeling scorched. Sleep itself was broken up, segmented by necessity. Without clocks, people lived by the natural rhythms of light and temperature. Many cultures practiced what's now called first sleep and second sleep, waking for an hour or two in the middle of the night before drifting back down. Maybe you use that time to tend a fire, check on animals, whisper with your spouse, or simply sit under the stars. If you think insomnia is a modern curse, think again. It was normal then, baked into the rhythms of ancient life. And rest didn't always mean sleep. Midday pauses were crucial, especially in scorching regions. Entire towns could go silent as people retreated into the shade during the deadliest hours. Inside, bodies sprawled across mats, conserving energy while the sun blazed outside. We might call it a nap. They might have called it survival. This wasn't indulgence, it was strategy. Shaving off the hours when working outdoors could kill you. Even rulers respected the logic. Kings might hold court at dawn or after sunset, while the burning middle of the day was practically off limits. But what about leisure, the kind of rest that refreshes the soul? It existed, but don't expect bowling alleys or Netflix binges. Leisure was bound to community and ritual. Music, for example, was woven into daily life. A farmer might hum while grinding grain, or families might gather at night, to share songs accompanied by simple instruments, drums, flutes, lyres. Dancing wasn't just fun. It was a release of tension, a way to burn off the constant stress of labor. Storytelling thrived too. Around a fire, elders recounted myths, histories, or cautionary tales, their voices carrying across the dark. For children, these weren't just entertainment. They were lessons on survival, morality, and identity. Imagine growing up where your bedtime stories weren't about fairy tale castles, but about floods that wiped out villages or gods who punished laziness. Talk about motivation.
Games offered another form of relief. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient board games in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Senet, the royal game of Ar, and countless variants played with stones or carved pieces. These weren't distractions in the modern sense. They were symbolic, often tied to ideas of fate, luck, or the afterlife. Playing a board game after a long day wasn't just killing time, it was engaging with beliefs, sharpening your wits, and maybe proving to your neighbor that you were luckier than they were. Even leisure reinforced culture, faith, and hierarchy. And let's not forget festivals. For commoners, they were rare explosions of joy and collective rest from the grind. Harvest festivals, religious ceremonies, or royal celebrations gave people an excuse to down tools, eat better food than usual, and participate in rituals that connected them to something larger than themselves. Sure, it was often organized for political or religious reasons, to remind the masses who was in charge, or to appease the gods. But for the average laborer, it was a chance to dance, drink, and maybe forget for a few hours how much their back hurt. Imagine the relief of slipping into festival clothes, joining a crowd, and watching priests parade idols or animals through the streets. For once, everyone was in it together, not sweating in fields, not grinding grain, but laughing, singing, and pretending life wasn't so crushingly hard.
Still, even leisure had limits. You couldn't take a week off. You couldn't rest up for a month after harvest. The cycles of survival left no room for extended idleness. The land waited for no one, and animals demanded care every single day. Festivals ended, music faded, and the grind resumed as predictably as the sunrise. The contrast was sharp. One night of celebration could be followed by a dawn of aching muscles and blistering heat. If anything, leisure highlighted how fleeting comfort was, how thin the line was between relief and toil. It's sobering to realize that rest, which we now see as a right, was then a fragile privilege. Today, we design our homes around comfort, plush beds, climate control, blackout curtains. They designed theirs around endurance. Today, we mark vacations on calendars months in advance. They stole moments of joy where they could, sandwiched between cycles of sowing, reaping, grinding, and hauling. For us, rest is restorative. For them, rest was survival. It wasn't about self-care. It was about making sure you could wake up tomorrow and do it all over again.
And yet, despite how meager it was, rest mattered. Those stolen naps, Those rooftop nights under the stars, those bursts of song or dance, they weren't just filler between work shifts. They were what kept people human in the face of relentless conditions. They were the threads of resilience woven through the grind of existence, proving that even when the sun burned hottest and the work weighed heaviest, the human spirit could still carve out space for relief, laughter, and meaning.
If we zoom out for a moment, it becomes clear that the story of Assyrian expansion wasn't just about military victories or piling up bricks of tribute. It was about creating a rhythm of power, an almost ritualistic cycle of conquest, subjugation, revolt, and reconquest. Each campaign wasn't simply about land. It was about reaffirming the cosmic order that the Assyrians believed they embodied. To them, the king wasn't merely a man with a crown and some muscle behind him. He was the earthly instrument of Ashur, their chief deity, a living vessel who was obligated to march out, to punish the wicked, to collect tribute, and to expand the boundaries of order against the creeping chaos of the world beyond. This religious dimension gave the Assyrian war machine a terrifying kind of legitimacy. When Ashur-nasir-pal II ordered mass deportations, when Tiglath-Pileser III slashed through rebel cities, when Sargon II carved his name into stone reliefs with captives kneeling at his feet, it wasn't just king doing king stuff. It was divine duty. In fact, the annals and inscriptions often read like sermons dressed in blood and iron, the king boasting of slaughter not as cruelty, but as righteousness. And to the people living under Assyrian rule, this meant submission wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Resistance wasn't rebellion against a government. It was rebellion against the very will of the gods. That's a heavy theological brick to carry on your back.
Yet, for all the divine dressing, the empire's cohesion was fragile. Cities on the fringes of the empire would pay tribute, yes, but loyalty was paper-thin. The moment an Assyrian army turned its attention elsewhere, revolts sparked like dry grass in summer. Babylon, of course, was the most persistent thorn, sometimes compliant, sometimes rebellious, always proud. The Assyrians knew they couldn't simply erase Babylon. It was too sacred, too steeped in myth, too integral to Mesopotamian identity. So instead, they played a dangerous game of domination and appeasement. One year marching in with armies, the next year marrying daughters into Babylonian royal houses, the year after that setting up puppet kings who immediately betrayed them. It was like trying to babysit a cobra, calm for a moment, then suddenly striking. Economically, the empire thrived on this mix of fear and dependence. Tribute wasn't just silver and gold. It was grain, timber, wine, livestock, and most importantly, people. Skilled artisans were uprooted from conquered lands and resettled in Assyrian heartlands, fueling construction booms and enriching the cities. Imagine the shock for a craftsman from Damascus or Samaria, suddenly finding himself in Nineveh, carving reliefs of the very army that had dragged him across the desert. This system of enforced migration created a strange melting pot inside Assyria, a patchwork of languages, traditions, and skills,
all reoriented to serve imperial grandeur. But this wasn't simply an economic strategy, it was psychological warfare. By shuffling populations, the Assyrians cut the ties between people and their ancestral lands, stripping them of identity and, in many cases, the will to resist. A farmer who no longer plowed the same soil his grandfather had plowed was easier to control. And yet, ironically, this very system laid the groundwork for the empire's undoing. The deportant peoples carried with them stories, resentments, and religious convictions that would later erupt in ways the Assyrians couldn't contain.
Meanwhile, the capital cities of the empire gleamed. Nimrud, under Ashurnasirpal II, became a showcase of brutality meets opulence. The grand throne room, the carved alabaster reliefs, the winged Lamassu statues, all of it was propaganda in stone. Walk into those halls, and you'd be surrounded by images of the king trampling enemies, hunting lions, receiving tribute from cowering foreign rulers. Even dinner parties were staged with a sense of theater. Guests would sit surrounded by walls, screaming the message, "This is what happens if you cross us." But here's the strange paradox. While the Assyrians were masters of intimidation, they were also connoisseurs of beauty. They pioneered botanical gardens, importing exotic trees and plants to create little Edens within their cities. They experimented with hydraulic engineering, irrigation systems, aqueducts, innovations that would later inspire rulers from Persia to Rome. In their obsession with control, they also pushed human ingenuity to new heights. Brutality and brilliance, hand in hand. Of course, none of this solved the looming problem: size. The empire was too big, too fast, too heavy. The Assyrian war machine was like a predator that had to keep hunting or starve. Every new campaign meant more tribute, more resources, but it also meant more territory to police, more restless populations to manage, more enemies nursing grudges in the shadows. The Assyrians had built a juggernaut, but one that required constant motion. The day they slowed down would be the day the cracks began to show. And those cracks were already forming. Egypt, bruised but unbroken, continued to resist Assyrian control. Babylon remained a tempest. The Elamites to the east were troublesome neighbors, and in the west, small kingdoms, Israel, Judah, Phoenician cities, walked the tightrope between appeasement and rebellion, always looking for the right moment to slip out from under Assyria's shadow. The Assyrians, of course, responded the only way they knew how, with more campaigns, more terror, more monuments proclaiming eternal dominance. But even eternity has an expiration date.
If the empire in its heyday was a lion on the hunt, then by the late 8th and early 7th centuries BCE, that lion had grown both hungrier and more restless. The Assyrian kings of this period, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esar-Haddon, and Ashurbanipal were not merely rulers but architects of a terrifyingly efficient imperial system. Each one left their mark in ways that still echo in dusty tablets and toppled walls. Take Tiglath-Pileser III, for example. Before him, the Assyrian Empire was powerful but clunky, like a cart with too many squeaky wheels. His genius lay in reshaping the administrative framework. Instead of leaving conquered lands in the hands of potentially unreliable local rulers, he broke territories into smaller provinces directly overseen by Assyrian officials. This centralized structure allowed for tighter control, faster response to rebellion, and a more consistent flow of tribute. In other words, he turned the empire from a loose coalition into a well-oiled bureaucracy. And nothing says modern empire like bureaucracy.
Then came Sargon II, who wasn't just a ruler, but a brand builder. He constructed a brand new capital city, Dur-Sharrukin, essentially an Assyrian Disneyland of power. Massive walls, palaces lined with intricate reliefs, colossal Lamassu guardians at the gates. It was as if he wanted to carve his own permanence into the earth itself. The irony? He died in battle before even moving into the city, and his successors abandoned it. Imagine pouring your fortune into building the ultimate dream mansion, only for your heirs to shrug and say, "Nah, we'll pass." It's one of history's great architectural anticlimaxes. Sennacherib, on the other hand, was the empire's mad scientist. He shifted the capital to Nineveh and turned it into one of the most impressive cities of the ancient world. His engineering feats were jaw-dropping. Aqueducts, canals, and irrigation systems that funneled water across miles of desert into lush palace gardens. These gardens, described by later writers, may even have inspired the legend of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Picture it: towering terraces filled with greenery, an oasis of beauty sustained by ingenious hydraulics. But Sennacherib was also infamous for his ruthlessness. His campaign against Babylon ended with him destroying the city so thoroughly that he flooded its ruins with water. He wasn't just conquering, he was rewriting landscapes. Esar-Haddon, Sennacherib's son, took a more calculated approach. He realized that burning Babylon to the ground might not have been the best long-term PR move. So he set about rebuilding it, a gesture that both restored prestige and calmed Babylonian resentment, at least temporarily. He also pulled off one of the boldest moves in Near Eastern politics, conquering Egypt. Marching Assyrian armies all the way to the Nile was no small feat, and for a brief shining moment, the empire's reach stretched from the mountains of Iran to the sands of North Africa. And then there was Ashurbanipal, often remembered as the Scholar King. Unlike his predecessors,
who seemed happiest knee-deep in battlefield gore, Ashurbanipal had a taste for books. He created the legendary Library of Nineveh, amassing thousands of clay tablets on everything from epic poetry to medical texts. Thanks to him, we even have the Epic of Gilgamesh today. Imagine that, one of the world's oldest literary masterpieces, preserved not because someone cared about art for art's sake, but because an Assyrian king wanted to flex his intellectual muscles. But don't be fooled. Ashurbanipal wasn't some gentle nerd in a crown. He could be as savage as any of his ancestors, boasting of tearing rebels apart, chaining kings, and stuffing enemies' mouths with the heads of their own kin. Scholar by day, warlord by night. Under these rulers, the Assyrian Empire reached its peak, politically, territorially, and culturally. Its armies were unmatched, its cities glittered with wealth, and its propaganda machine was in overdrive. The reliefs carved into palace walls weren't just decoration, they were a visual Instagram feed of dominance. Lion hunts, sieges, parades of tribute. They told a story of unstoppable power. Every visitor walking through those halls would leave with the same impression. This was a people destined to rule forever.
But history has a way of turning swagger into foreshadowing. The very traits that made Assyria so powerful, the reliance on terror, the relentless need for expansion, the constant reshuffling of populations, were also ticking time bombs. People don't forget being impaled or deported. They don't forget their gods being mocked, their temples burned, their children dragged away. Hatred was building at the empire's edges like storm clouds on the horizon. And inside, cracks were beginning to show. Managing such a vast empire required near superhuman coordination, and while the Assyrian kings were often brilliant, they were also mortal. Succession disputes, assassinations, palace intrigues, all of these simmered under the gilded surface. The empire wasn't just battling rebels abroad, it was battling itself at home.
By the mid-7th century BCE, Assyria stood like a colossus straddling the Near East, towering, magnificent, and terrifying. But every colossus has ankles, and sometimes all it takes is the right swing of the hammer.
For centuries, Assyria had been the schoolyard bully of the ancient Near East. And like any bully, the longer they strutted around, the more everyone else quietly dreamed of the day they could finally shove them face first into the dirt. By the late 7th century BCE, those dreams were becoming dangerously real. The great lion of Mesopotamia was starting to limp, and its prey had noticed. It began with overextension. Empires thrive on conquest, but the bigger you get, the more plates you've got to keep spinning. From the Iranian plateau to the Nile Delta,
Assyrian officials were scrambling to keep provinces in line, collect tribute, move troops, and stamp out rebellions. Each new province added wealth, but also multiplied the headaches. Even the most efficient bureaucracy can only stretch so far before it starts tearing at the seams. And for Assyria, those seams were fraying.
Then there was the sheer brutality of their rule. Assyrian kings didn't do subtle. They didn't just want you to obey, they wanted you to cower. Whole populations had been uprooted, marched in chains to distant corners of the empire. Cities that dared resist were leveled, their leaders impaled in public squares. It was an empire held together with blood and fear. And while that works for a while, it's not exactly a recipe for long-term loyalty. When the cracks appeared, people weren't just rebelling, they were rebelling with vengeance. And Babylon, Babylon. If Assyria had a rival that was part thorn in the side, part arch nemesis, it was that glittering city on the Euphrates. The Babylonians had endured Assyrian domination for decades, sometimes grudgingly cooperating, sometimes erupting into revolt. Under the leadership of Nabopolassar in 626 BCE, they found their moment. Seizing on Assyria's internal turmoil, Nabopolassar declared independence and rallied Babylon back into power. For the first time in generations, the mighty Assyrians weren't just facing rebellious subjects, they were facing a serious contender for regional dominance.
The dominoes started falling. Neighboring peoples who'd spent centuries crushed under Assyrian boots smelled opportunity. The Medes in the east, hardened mountain warriors, began pressing against Assyria's borders. Formerly cowed provinces like Elam and Urartu shook off the yoke, and alliances began to form. Alliances that just a few decades earlier would have seemed laughable. Babylonians and Medes, natural rivals, found common cause in hating Assyria more than they hated each other. Nothing brings frenemies together like mutual resentment. Inside the empire, things weren't exactly rosy either. Assyrian kings in this period had to contend with not just external enemies, but family feuds and succession crises. Ashur-banipal's death left a power vacuum that spiraled into civil war between his sons. While they squabbled over the throne, enemies outside the empire sharpened their swords. It was like watching a heavyweight champion pause mid-fight to argue with his corner while the challenger winds up for the knockout punch.
And the punch came hard. In 614 BCE, the Medes captured Ashur, the ancient religious heart of the empire. Imagine the shock. The city that had given Assyria its name, the place where kings had once been crowned and gods worshipped, was sacked by outsiders. It wasn't just a military loss, it was a psychic wound, a sign that the empire wasn't invincible anymore. 2 years later, in 612 BCE, the hammer truly fell. A coalition of Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, and others laid siege to Nineveh, the jewel of Assyria. This was the city that Sennacherib had transformed into a wonder of the world,
filled with palaces, libraries, and gardens. For 3 months, the coalition forces battered its defenses. Ancient chroniclers describe torrential rains swelling the rivers and weakening the city's walls, nature itself seemingly conspiring against the Assyrians.
When Nineveh fell, it wasn't just another city taken. It was an apocalypse for the Assyrian world. The attackers showed no mercy. The city was looted, its treasures carried off, its people slaughtered or enslaved. The once glittering palaces were reduced to rubble. Ashurbanipal's fabled library was buried in the destruction, its clay tablets baked into preservation by the fires that consumed the city. Ironically, Assyria's cultural legacy survived precisely because of its obliteration. The last scraps of the empire staggered on for a few years. Remnants of the Assyrian army regrouped at Haran, then at Carchemish, clinging desperately to survival. But the momentum was gone. By 609 BCE, the final Assyrian stronghold had fallen, and the empire that once terrified half the known world vanished from the political map. Just like that, the bully was gone, and the schoolyard was left to be carved up by new powers. Babylon rising once more in Mesopotamia, and the Medes staking their claim in the east.
It's hard to overstate the shockwaves this collapse sent across the ancient Near East. For centuries, Assyria had been the immovable giant, the constant force shaping the destinies of nations. And then, within the span of a single generation, it was obliterated. To put it in modern terms, it would be like the sudden disappearance of a superpower, not over decades of slow decline, but in a lightning storm of war and rebellion. And yet, Assyria didn't vanish completely. Its culture, its art, its innovations in governance and military organization, all of that seeped into the DNA of successor states. The Babylonians, Persians, even the Greeks would borrow from the administrative systems the Assyrians had perfected. Their reliefs and texts preserved glimpses of their grandeur. But as a living empire, as a terror in the flesh, Assyria was finished. The mighty lion lay dead, and the jackals feasted.
You'd think that when an empire dies so violently, it leaves nothing but silence. But Assyria's afterlife was anything but quiet. For those who lived in the shadow of its fall, the memory of Assyrian power lingered like a scar, raw, unhealed, impossible to ignore. And centuries later, when archaeologists began peeling back the sands of Mesopotamia, that scar was opened again, sparking awe, debate, and a little bit of horror.
Let's start with the immediate aftermath. When Babylon and the Medes divided the spoils of Assyria, they weren't just conquering land, they were seizing psychological victory. The Babylonians, in particular, reveled in it. Their chronicles describe the fall of Nineveh with grim satisfaction, framing it as divine justice, as if the gods themselves had finally grown tired of Assyrian arrogance. To them, the destruction of Assyria wasn't a tragedy. It was cosmic balance restored. Imagine your hated school principal finally getting fired, and everyone in the cafeteria erupting into applause. That was Babylon, but multiplied by 100.
But memory has a funny way of twisting with time. The Persians who came later didn't speak of Assyria with pure hatred. They inherited Assyrian systems of administration and communication. The use of provinces, roads, messengers, and satraps all had roots in Assyrian practice. To them, Assyria was less the boogeyman and more the stern grandfather figure, terrifying in the stories but grudgingly respected. Even the Achaemenid kings styled themselves as heirs of Mesopotamian rulers, positioning their empire not as a break with the past, but as the next chapter in a very old story.
The Greeks? They added their own spin. Herodotus and later writers spoke of Assyria in half-remembered anecdotes, mixing fact with legend. For them, Assyria and Babylonia blurred together into a catch-all image of exotic Eastern decadence. They told tales of vast armies, towering walls, and mysterious queens. Semiramis, for example, a mythical figure supposedly ruling Assyria with cunning and beauty. She's probably a composite of several queens and consorts, inflated into legend. Leave it to the Greeks to turn Assyrian history into tabloid drama.
Then came the Bible, and here the Assyrians got one of their most enduring reputations: villains cast in eternal stone. The Old Testament bristles with references to Assyria as God's rod of anger, the punisher of Israel, and yet also as the nation destined for destruction because of its cruelty. The siege of Lachish, immortalized in Assyrian reliefs, is echoed in biblical laments of invasion. Jonah's reluctant mission to Nineveh, whether parable or memory, framed the city as a symbol of sin so vast it required divine intervention. By the time Jewish scribes finished their work, Assyria was no longer just a historical empire. It was a metaphor for arrogance, oppression, and downfall. That reputation would stick for millennia.
And then, silence. For nearly 2,000 years, the ruins of Nineveh, Ashur, and Nimrud lay buried under earth and rumor. Locals living near the mounds in what is now Iraq saw only strange hills, sometimes looting them for bricks, sometimes spinning tales of ancient kings turned to dust. Travelers like Xenophon in the 4th century BCE marched past crumbling ruins and guessed they were remnants of forgotten cities. But no one truly grasped that this was once the beating heart of the world's fiercest empire. Assyria slipped into the shadows of memory, its very name half lost, surviving only in scriptures and echoes. That all changed in the 19th century. Picture a world obsessed with discovering its past. Europe in the age of Napoleon, colonial expansion, and biblical archaeology. Adventurers and scholars began poking around Mesopotamia, spurred by curiosity, faith, and more than a little imperial ambition. In 1842, the French consul Paul-Émile Botta dug into a mound near Mosul and struck gold, or rather, struck lamassu. Out came colossal stone guardians, winged bulls with human faces, standing as if frozen mid-roar. The world gaped. Assyria was real, and it was monumental. A few years later, Austin Henry Layard, a British adventurer with more enthusiasm than formal training, continued the excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh. What he unearthed stunned Europe. Endless walls covered in intricate reliefs of battles, lion hunts, sieges, and ceremonies. Entire palace rooms were lined with these carvings, their details so vivid that you could practically hear the clash of chariots and the roar of lions. These weren't just ruins, they were storyboards of empire. Layard shipped many of them back to the British Museum, where they became sensations. Imagine being a Victorian Londoner, walking into a hall and suddenly standing face to face with the stone gaze of a lamassu that had once guarded Sargon's palace. It was like discovering dinosaurs, but with human pride attached. And then came the crown jewel, Ashurbanipal's library. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, baked and broken yet legible, covered everything from royal decrees to astronomical charts, medical prescriptions, omens, and myths. Among them lay the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story older than the Bible, preserved by chance in the ashes of Nineveh. This wasn't just archaeology. It was a resurrection of voices silenced for millennia. Suddenly, the Assyrians weren't only conquerors in reliefs. They were thinkers, poets, scholars. The duality of Ashurbanipal, scholar, king, and warlord, stared modern readers right in the face. Of course, there was irony in this rediscovery. The same empire once feared as the scourge of nations was now a darling of museums, dissected and displayed for the amusement and edification of Western audiences. People marveled at Assyria's art while quietly forgetting the screams those reliefs originally commemorated. The terror had turned into spectacle, the propaganda of kings now reduced to conversation pieces in genteel drawing rooms. The Assyrians, masters of image, would probably have appreciated the cosmic joke. By the 20th century, Assyria's image shifted again. Archaeologists kept digging, unearthing more palaces, temples, and tablets. Scholars debated whether the empire should be seen primarily as a brutal war machine or as a sophisticated state that laid groundwork for future civilizations. Assyria became both, a paradox that refused to fit neatly into any one box. The cruelty was undeniable, but so was the brilliance of its administration, the artistry of its reliefs, the vision of its engineers. It was a civilization both monstrous and magnificent, a reminder that greatness and brutality often walk hand in hand.
And in modern times,
the lands of ancient Assyria remain contested, scarred by war and upheaval. Some of the ruins unearthed by Laird and others have been damaged or destroyed in recent decades, victims of modern conflict and iconoclasm. It's a haunting echo of Nineveh's fall. Empires collapsing, monuments shattering, history trembling under the weight of violence. Yet, through records, replicas, and scholarship, Assyria endures. The lion may be dead, but its shadow stretches long.
So here we are, thousands of years later, still captivated by a civilization that thrived on fear and left behind stone and clay to prove it. Their empire crumbled, their cities burned, their name almost forgotten. But dig just a little beneath the surface, and the Assyrians roar back to life. And now, after walking through the rise, the terror, the splendor, the collapse, and the rediscovery of Assyria, we come to the end of our journey. So what do we do with a civilization like this? An empire remembered both for its brilliance and for its brutality, for its dazzling achievements and for the screams that accompanied them. The Assyrians weren't saints, and they certainly weren't underdogs. They were conquerors, pure and simple, and they didn't bother pretending otherwise. They invented the art of psychological warfare long before anyone called it that, turning cruelty into a political strategy. And yet, behind the horror, there's something undeniably fascinating: the sheer audacity of their ambition. They didn't just want to rule their neighbors. They wanted to bend the entire world into their orbit, and for a while, they almost pulled it off. Their empire was a laboratory for ideas that outlived them. The provincial system, the use of governors, roads, communication networks, these weren't just footnotes, they were blueprints. Later empires, from the Persians to the Romans, borrowed heavily from the Assyrian playbook. Even the very notion of empire, as we understand it today, owes something to their relentless experimentation. That's the paradox. The tools of governance we admire were hammered out in the same furnaces that burned cities and enslaved peoples.
And then there's their art. Walk through any museum with Assyrian reliefs and you'll feel the weight of their vision. The panels of lion hunts don't just show a king killing animals. They're allegories of power, civilization's triumph over chaos. The siege scenes aren't random decorations. They're the empire writing its story in stone, ensuring everyone who entered those palaces understood what defiance meant. It's propaganda, yes, but it's propaganda of stunning artistry. They turned terror into aesthetics, brutality into beauty. That's uncomfortable, but it's also true.
When we talk about Assyria today, we often fixate on its cruelty, and with good reason. The records they left behind practically revel in gore. But maybe the bigger story is how fragile even the mightiest power can be. For centuries, Assyria seemed untouchable.
Then, in just a handful of years, it collapsed so thoroughly that later generations barely remembered its name. There's a lesson there, one that echoes uncomfortably into our modern world. Dominance is never permanent. Arrogance and fear can buy time, but not eternity.
And yet a serious shadow endures. We live in a world where states still use intimidation, where propaganda still lines walls and screens, where empires still rise and fall. In many ways, we haven't changed that much. When you scroll through images of leaders posing for carefully crafted photo ops, or when you see nations flexing their power on the world stage, remember the Lamassu standing guard at Nineveh. Remember the reliefs of Sennacherib parading prisoners. The mediums have changed. The message has not.
There's also something deeply human in the Assyrian story. Strip away the scale, and what do we see? People working in fields, carrying water, baking bread, raising children, building houses of mud brick, praying to their gods for mercy. The kings may have written their glory into stone, but the commoners lived their lives in sweat and dust, surviving as best they could under the weight of empire. Their names are lost, but their labor built everything. It's easy to be dazzled by kings and generals, but empires are really the sum of millions of ordinary lives, stacked one on top of the other like bricks in a wall.
Maybe that's the real takeaway. The Assyrians remind us that history is never just about triumph or terror. It's about the tension between the two. They were cruel, but they were also brilliant. They were feared, but they were also imitated. They vanished, but they also endured. Every empire carries that duality, and every society, including ours, walks that same fine line between creation and destruction. So as we close the chapter on Assyria, think of the image that has survived most vividly: the lion hunt. A king in his chariot, bow drawn, arrows flying, lions roaring in desperation. It's theater, a ritual of dominance. But look closer. The lions fight back. They leap, they claw, they refuse to go quietly. In those carved muscles and snarling jaws, you can feel resistance, defiance, life refusing to be erased. That too is part of the story.
Assyria fell, as all empires eventually do. Its cities crumbled, its kings faded into dust. Its enemies danced on its ruins. But the memory of its rise and fall, the awe, the fear, the lessons, has outlasted it all. And maybe that's what history is in the end. Not the permanence of power, but the echoes it leaves behind.
So the next time you hear about nations flexing their might or see monuments rising in self-celebration, remember Nineveh. Remember the Lamassu, silent and broken. Remember the roar of lions in stone. And remember that no empire, no matter how mighty, ever truly outruns the tide of time.
Thanks for sticking with me through this journey into the heart of one of history's most fascinating and fearsome civilizations. If you made it this far, hit that like button, subscribe for more dives into the past, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I'd love to see how far Assyria's echoes travel tonight. Now, dim the lights, take a breath, and let the dust of Nineveh settle in your mind. History may be carved in stone, but tonight it's alive in us. You're trudging back home, your feet caked with mud, your hands aching from the tools you've been gripping since sunrise. You've earned your rest, right? Wrong. Because while the noblemen might sink into cushions and demand entertainment, your evening leisure looks a lot like more work, just indoors. The hearth needs to be stoked, grain needs to be ground, animals have to be checked, and that thatched roof, it always seems to have one more leak that needs patching before the rains set in. Home wasn't an escape from labor, it was an extension of it. And let's talk about home. We romanticize the cozy little peasant hut with its rustic charm, but in reality, it was drafty, smoky, and smelled of a mix between damp straw and barnyard funk. In ancient Mesopotamia, houses were often made of mud brick that crumbled away unless constantly maintained. In medieval Europe, wooden huts with thatched roofs became fire hazards that went up in flames faster than you could yell "bucket line." And don't forget the animals. Chickens wandering freely inside, goats bleeding in the corner, maybe even the family cow tied up near the door. Not exactly the ideal Airbnb listing, but hey, at least you didn't have to walk far to get fresh milk. Inside, things were no more glamorous. Furniture was sparse, usually just a wooden bench, maybe a rough-hewn table, and straw pallets on the floor for sleeping. Privacy? Forget it. Mom, dad, kids, and sometimes grandparents all packed into one smoky room, everyone snoring, coughing, and turning over all night. Add in fleas, lice, and the occasional rodent scurrying across the floorboards, and you've got yourself the kind of bedtime experience no spa-scented candle can fix. And then there's the food prep, which wasn't just dinner time, but practically an Olympic event. Grain had to be ground by hand with heavy stones, a process so time-consuming and backbreaking that archaeologists find it literally reshaped women's skeletons, warped knees and spines, the marks of endless hours bent over grindstones. Boiling water meant kindling a fire and keeping it alive, usually in the same room where the family slept, meaning you were living in a constant haze of smoke. You didn't complain though. You just coughed, wheezed, and kept stirring that pot of thin, watery porridge. Leisure existed, but it was fleeting and often communal. Maybe you'd share a drink of weak beer with neighbors, sing songs, or tell stories by the fire. In ancient Egypt, music and dance made appearances even in modest villages, with flutes and hand drums keeping spirits alive after long days in the fields. In medieval Europe, storytelling was king, with tales of knights, saints, or, let's be real, local gossip spicing up the otherwise repetitive nights.
These weren't luxuries though. They were survival strategies. A laugh, a story, or a shared song kept you sane when life seemed like one endless loop of toil.
And, of course, religion seeped into these evenings as well. Families prayed to their gods, ancestors, or saints, asking for protection over the night because the darkness was terrifying. No streetlights, no glow from a city skyline, just pitch black void outside your door, filled with the sounds of wolves, thieves, or who knows what. That's why charms, talismans, and prayers were as essential as a warm blanket. You couldn't see what lurked beyond the fields, but you knew it was out there. Now imagine lying down after all that, finally resting on a straw mattress crawling with bedbugs. You listen to the fire crackle, the animals shifting in their corners, your family breathing heavily all around you. The day has been nothing but toil, but tomorrow will be exactly the same, because for a commoner, home wasn't a refuge from labor. It was the center of survival itself, as relentless as the fields, the pyramids, or the rice paddies. Would you have managed a smile at the end of such a day? Or would you have collapsed without a word, your dreams interrupted by the cough of your neighbor, the cry of your child, or the squeak of a rat making itself at home? Either way, dawn was only a few hours away, and the grind would begin all over again. You wake up again before the sun, because in a world without clocks, your rooster, your aching back, or your neighbor's noisy goat was the only alarm you got. And what's waiting for you? Not a slow morning with coffee and news headlines, but the same relentless routine you've been stuck in since birth. The cycle of work, eat, pray, collapse, repeat. But don't get too comfortable, because life as a commoner wasn't just exhausting, it was also brutally short. Let's talk about health. Or, more accurately, the almost total absence of it. For most of history, the average life expectancy hovered somewhere between 30 and 40 years. Not because people just dropped dead on their 35th birthday, but because infant mortality was off the charts, and diseases mowed down entire families without discrimination. If you actually survived childhood, and that was a miracle in itself, you might live into your 50s or even 60s, but you'd carry the scars of every fever, infection, and injury along the way. Medicine. Oh, you mean the witch's brew of prayers, herbs, and guesswork. Got a fever? In ancient Mesopotamia, maybe a priest would chant incantations while smearing you with strange ointments. In medieval Europe, a barber surgeon might bleed you out to balance the humors, because, losing a pint of blood is definitely going to cure that plague. And in Egypt, well, you might be prescribed a dose of crocodile dung mixed with honey. Delicious. Spoiler alert, none of it worked. Dental care was another horror show. Grinding all that grain on primitive millstones left tiny bits of grit in bread, meaning every meal slowly sanded your teeth down. Cavities, abscesses,
and tooth loss were almost guaranteed. And let's be real, no one was rocking a Colgate smile. Archaeologists regularly find skulls with jaws riddled with infections so severe they would have caused constant pain until death. Toothache wasn't a minor annoyance, it was a torment that could literally kill you. Injuries were equally unforgiving. Break a bone while hauling stones for a pyramid? Good luck. Maybe it healed crooked, maybe it never healed at all, and maybe it ended your ability to work, effectively signing your death sentence. There was no disability pension, no rehab, no sick leave. If you couldn't contribute, you became a burden, and burdens didn't last long in societies that already had too little to go around. And then there were the big killers: plague, famine, war. One bad harvest could starve half a village. A single outbreak of smallpox or bubonic plague could erase generations in weeks. If you think the flu is inconvenient today, imagine it without antibiotics, doctors, or even the faintest idea of germs. People thought disease came from angry gods, bad air, or cursed neighbors, which meant that in addition to suffering through illness, you might also be accused of causing it, and suddenly you're the village scapegoat. Even childbirth, the most natural event in the world, was a deadly gamble. For women, it was often the leading cause of death. With no antiseptics, no clean instruments, and no understanding of infection, childbirth was less a miracle and more a terrifying roll of the dice. And for every baby that didn't make it, grief was swallowed and life moved on because survival demanded it. But here's the cruel irony. Despite all this misery, commoners didn't see themselves as unfortunate souls trudging through endless pain. This was just life. Hardship wasn't the exception, it was the baseline. The shared suffering created resilience, community, and a sense of purpose that modern comfort often lacks. When every meal, every shelter, and every sunrise was uncertain, you learned to appreciate the smallest victories: a good harvest, a healthy child, a night without coughing. So when you picture the pyramids, the rice fields, or the cathedrals, don't just imagine the back-breaking labor. Imagine the constant shadow of sickness and death hovering over every worker, every farmer, every mother rocking her child by firelight. Because history wasn't just built on sweat, it was built on survival against impossible odds. Now, here's the real kicker. Would you have lasted a week in their shoes? Or would you have tapped out the first time a barber surgeon came at you with a rusty knife, claiming he could cure your headache by drilling a hole in your skull? By now, you're probably realizing that history's commoner experience wasn't just a tough job. It was a non-stop battle for survival. And survival wasn't just about food or avoiding disease. It was also about power, or rather, the complete lack of it. Because while kings and emperors strutted around with golden crowns and armies at their command, the people actually keeping society alive had less say in their destiny than the mud under their feet. Think about it. Who decided where you lived, what you worked on, what you ate, and even who you married? Not you. In most places, the hierarchy was carved in stone. You were born into your role, and that was it. In Egypt, if your father was a farmer, congratulations, you're a farmer too, forever tethered to the Nile's flooding schedule. In medieval Europe, you were bound to the land, meaning your body was practically an extension of the soil you plowed. Your lord owned it, and by extension, he kind of owned you too. Taxes? Oh, they were relentless. And they weren't just coins. A pharaoh didn't care if you had a handful of copper. He wanted grain, labor, and loyalty. So every harvest, officials showed up with tallies and guards, making sure you handed over your due. In China, peasants dreaded corvée labor, a polite way of saying the state could yank you away from your rice fields to build roads, canals, or palaces. Imagine being barely able to feed your family, and then suddenly you're dragged off to help carve a new irrigation system that will mainly benefit the elite. And it wasn't just the government. Religion got its cut too. Temples demanded offerings. Priests insisted on sacrifices, and festivals ate up resources. You might think of it as community spirit, but when you've already lost half your harvest to taxes, giving up another portion to the gods feels less like worship and more like extortion. Still, you did it, because angering the gods was the one risk you couldn't afford to take.
Justice? Forget about it. The law wasn't blind. It was glaringly biased. Steal a loaf of bread because your family is starving, and you could be flogged, mutilated, or even executed. Meanwhile, the local noble could ride roughshod over your property, and the worst that might happen is a stern talking to. Punishments were designed not to rehabilitate, but to terrify. The message was clear: keep your head down, obey, and accept your lot.
But here's where it gets even darker. Sometimes the same system that oppressed you also demanded you fight and die for it. Drafts into the military were common. In Mesopotamia, peasants were routinely called up to defend city walls or march off in campaigns they didn't care about. In medieval Europe, your lord might rally you into his petty feuds, and suddenly you're a soldier, poorly armed, poorly trained, and highly expendable. If you lived, you went back to your field. If you died, well, there were plenty more peasants to replace you. And yet, within all this crushing control, small acts of resistance existed. Villagers shared food behind the tax collector's back. Workers sabotaged projects in subtle ways, like dragging their feet or taking extra rest breaks. Even humor became rebellion. Mocking songs, sly jokes about the nobility,
and whispered complaints around the fire were safety valves for the frustration of being powerless. They weren't revolutions, but they were sparks of human dignity.
The truly bold sometimes pushed further. Revolts flared up across history. Egyptian workers striking because they weren't fed. Medieval peasants storming castles. Chinese farmers uniting under banners to topple dynasties. Most of these rebellions failed, drowned in blood, but the fact that they kept happening tells you something important. Commoners weren't mindless drones. They knew the system was unfair. They felt the weight of injustice, and occasionally they fought to throw it off. So when you imagine the daily grind of history's laborers, don't just picture sweat and suffering. Picture this constant balancing act. Crushed under taxes, exploited by rulers, yet still carving out little slivers of defiance. Because even without power, they weren't powerless in spirit. They couldn't rewrite the laws or topple kings at will, but they could keep their humanity alive in the cracks of a system designed to erase it.
And maybe that's the most relatable part of all. Strip away the grand monuments and heroic histories, and you're left with people. Ordinary, stubborn, clever people finding ways to live under impossible pressure. And somehow that makes their endurance even more impressive than all the empires their sweat built.
By now, the picture is clear. Life for the commoner was a relentless slog, painted with sweat, hunger, and the looming shadow of authority. But before we wrap this journey, let's pull back and look at something else, the strange paradox at the heart of it all. Because despite the misery, the inequality, and the sheer back-breaking grind, commoners weren't just victims of history. They were its foundation. And without them, the pyramids, the rice fields, the cathedrals, the canals, none of it would have existed.
Take agriculture, for example. Forget the kings and generals. The true miracle workers were the farmers who kept millions alive. Every loaf of bread in an Egyptian market, every steaming bowl of rice in a Chinese village, every mug of ale in a medieval tavern, it all came from fields worked by nameless, sunburned men and women. The elite dined on banquets, but it was the peasants who tilled, planted, harvested, and hauled, season after season. And those monuments we marvel at today, you think pharaohs laid bricks? You think emperors hauled stones? Not a chance. The commoners' calloused hands stacked those blocks, carved those reliefs, dug those canals, all while their own huts sagged and their bellies rumbled. The irony is almost painful. Their blood built wonders that were never meant for them. But in building for others, they left behind the fingerprints of their existence in stone. Even culture itself was shaped by ordinary people. Folk songs, work chants, lullabies whispered beside smoky fires, these weren't created in palaces. They came from villages, fields, and marketplaces. Oral traditions, jokes, and stories carried the emotional weight of entire generations. While kings erected monuments to themselves, peasants left behind something less visible but just as powerful: the fabric of everyday human connection. And here's the kicker. While rulers rose and fell, commoners endured. Dynasties collapsed, empires crumbled, but the farmer still had to plow. The rice still had to be planted. The sheep still had to be herded. History books love to trace the lives of conquerors, but it was the anonymous masses who ensured continuity, who stitched together the long thread of human survival. Without them, history would have unraveled completely.
So maybe the real story isn't about the kings and generals at all. Maybe it's about the faceless millions who never had their names etched into stone, but whose labor kept the lights of civilization burning. They carried water, they broke their backs in fields, they endured disease and hunger, and still they kept going. Not because they wanted glory, but because survival left them no choice.
And when you think about it that way, the commoner becomes the true protagonist of history. They didn't get credit, they didn't get luxury, and they didn't get remembered. But they held the world together. Every day, in every corner of the earth, the grind continued, and in that grind, civilization found its heartbeat. As we head toward the final part of this journey, let's not just admire the monuments or pity the suffering. Let's recognize the resilience, the sheer will to keep pushing through a life that offered almost nothing in return. That's the story worth telling. This story hidden in calloused hands, in worn-down teeth, in quiet songs sung to children under leaky roofs. Because in the end, history wasn't just written by the victors, it was carried day after day by the ones who had no choice but to endure.
Hey, if you've stuck with me all this way, you've probably realized something. History doesn't belong to kings, emperors, or generals. It belongs to the millions of ordinary people whose names never made it into the records. From the pyramid haulers of Egypt to the rice planters of China, from the mud brick makers of Mesopotamia to the plowmen of medieval Europe, the real story of civilization was written not in palaces, but in sweat-soaked fields.
The romanticized version of history, gleaming temples, glittering crowns, shining armor, has always been a kind of lie, or at least a half-truth. Because behind every golden throne was an army of laborers carrying water buckets. Behind every banquet table was a starving farmer who wouldn't taste half the food he grew. Behind every glorious empire was a silent multitude, breaking their backs just to survive another day.
And yet, here's the twist. In their grind, in their struggle, commoners did more than survive. They endured. They adapted. They passed down knowledge, traditions, and resilience that outlasted the rulers who exploited them. Pharaohs came and went. Dynasties rose and collapsed. Kings fought bloody wars that erased entire cities. But the farmer still plowed the land the next morning. The mother still soothed her child with a song. The laborer still lifted the stone, carved the wood, baked the bread.
That's the paradox at the heart of human history. The most forgotten were the most essential. Civilization wasn't a gift handed down by the powerful. It was built, literally and figuratively, on the bones, the sweat, and the willpower of the powerless. The commoner's world was short, brutal, and unforgiving. But without it, there would be no monuments, no palaces, no history as we know it.
So the next time you look at the pyramids or a medieval cathedral or a rice terrace winding up a Chinese hillside, don't just marvel at the rulers who ordered them. Think about the nameless thousands whose hands left fingerprints in the mortar, whose songs echoed across the scaffolding, whose lives were swallowed by the project, but whose labor endures centuries later. That's their legacy, hidden in plain sight. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. We live in an age of comfort they couldn't imagine. Clean water on tap, antibiotics, electricity, Netflix. But the human grit that kept those ancient commoners alive, that's still in us. Their endurance is our inheritance.
So, next time you curse your morning commute or groan about a long workday, remember, at least you're not hauling stones for a pyramid while chewing on bread filled with sand. History's commoners didn't get luxury and they didn't get glory, but they did give us the world we stand on today.
And that's worth remembering. Thanks for joining me on this journey. If you made it here, give yourself some credit. You've done what most people in history couldn't. You had the time and comfort to sit back and listen. If you liked this trip through the real daily grind of the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Until next time, dim the lights, breathe easy, and remember, behind every empire, there's always a million unseen hands holding it up.